This is a very provocative book, which is our author has this book called Hitler's American Friends, and Brad Hart, or Bradley Hart. You look like a Bradley more than a Brad, if I can say that. Are you a Bradley?
I usually go by Bradley.
Yeah, so Bradley Hart has done this. This is a historic work. I mean, there's not a political agenda behind this book.
This is a work of pure history.
Yeah, and yet Hitler's American Friends, there's an eerie parallel to a lot of the talk that's going on in America today. And by that, I simply mean I learned that at the time, from a celebrity outsider as far as politics is concerned, there was this sort of fire-breathing political stuff that was coming in support of a lot of the things that were going on in Nazi Germany.
Yes.
And there was a fire-breathing political outsider who did well quite recently here in America.
There are definitely a lot of rhyming aspects between this book and what we're seeing today. The person you're referring to, of course, is Charles Lindbergh, who we remember today as the man who flies solo across the Atlantic in 1927. Some of us who are more versed in history might remember that his son was kidnapped and murdered in 1932. But the part that almost all of us have forgotten is that Lindbergh becomes one of the most notorious political figures of the late 1930s and early 1940s, a man who I think certainly could have been elected president at one point.
He was one of the most popular people in the world, right?
Arguably the most famous man in the world. There are some historians who argue that Lindbergh was actually more beloved than Franklin Roosevelt or any other political figure.
And this is at a time that aviation was just beginning to take hold, and he had done this incredible thing, right?
Absolutely. It was the equivalent of flying to the moon. Certainly Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin become great American heroes. There's a new film about them. But Charles Lindbergh is a similar figure. He's seen as the pinnacle of manliness. He's seen as a sex symbol. He's the most photographed man in the world at one point, we believe. And then he throws it all away with his political views.
He decides to really lean into his political views, which are openly in support of fascism.
And this is something, again, that we've forgotten. Charles Lindbergh actually goes off to Nazi Germany. He does not meet Adolf Hitler, but he meets Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, and he meets a number of leading Nazis and is highly impressed by what he sees there, not just in terms of aviation. This is, of course, what he's primarily impressed by, or initially impressed by, is that German aircraft production is incredible and all these things, but he's also impressed by the Nazi social system. He's impressed by what Hitler is doing. And he comes back to America, and as I argue in the book, begins advocating for very similar policies in this country.
And again, this is around what year? Where are we in the development of Germany at this point, Nazi Germany?
So this is right before the war. Lindbergh's going there in 1938, 1939. I mean, this is only months in some cases before the invasion of Poland, where he's actually meeting with these figures. He comes back to America shortly before the war begins and begins advocating against U.S. involvement. And so Lindbergh becomes, in my mind, a very dangerous figure. He's a staunch opponent of Roosevelt. We are fortunate, I think, that in the election of 1940, where Roosevelt runs for the unprecedented third term. Again, imagine somebody running for a third term in office today. It's almost unthinkable. No president's done it before or since. Lindbergh is not quite ready to run for president, but becomes a staunch Roosevelt opponent. And I think we're very lucky that he was not prepared to enter politics at the highest levels at that point.
Well, the other thing that is eerily similar and that you really pull together is that you reference the strange allies, I'm talking about political allies, within the movement that Lindbergh finds. This isn't a book about Lindbergh, it's more of a story of how America has all of these different factions that line up and oddly support Nazi fascism.
Absolutely. They support fascism to some extent, but they also oppose American entrance into the war.
And that was a way to stop the fascism going on.
Exactly. And this is where you have an interesting sort of conglomeration of events, right? In 1940-41, Lindbergh comes back. He's this incredibly popular figure. The other groups I talk about in this book are very heavily pro-Nazi. These are organizations that directly are emulating the Nazi Party, have actual Nazi Party members who have immigrated to the U.S. from Germany in the 1920s. These people are trying to establish a fascist dictatorship. And it just so happens that those groups align with one another in 1940-41 to oppose the war, but also with sort of darker motives as well.
I mean, these anti-interventionists, you find it in every epoch of this country, right? Those who don't want to get involved. And yet, in this case, one could say there was a moral imperative to get involved because of what was going on in Nazi Germany.
Absolutely, and that's something that is really troubling about this book, and certainly troubled me doing the research, is that you're absolutely right that for most of this country's history, isolationism, or non-intervention if you prefer, was the predominant foreign policy. That goes back to George Washington and the Founding Fathers. What's interesting in this period is that we have this retrospective view now of seeing World War II as a moral war, because of course we know about the Holocaust. Hindsight is 20/20. And people sort of knew what was going on. It's not like people didn't think that Hitler was anti-Semitic or things like that. That was very widely known and reported. But certainly there were people who argued the U.S. shouldn't get involved. This wasn't America's fight. Or even more dangerously, that we should potentially ally with Nazi Germany. Not necessarily out of purely racist motivations or anti-Semitic motivations, but because the Nazis are seen as a positive alternative to communism. We have to remember that the fear of communism is really at the heart of a lot of this.
Yeah, the enemy, my enemy is my friend type thing.
Precisely, and that's what these people are arguing, is that, Hitler may not be a great guy, but at least he's not Stalin. And this is what actually attracts a lot of American business people into Nazi affinities.
I'm so glad you talk about the business because, again, it's eerily similar to today where we feel we're held hostage in terms of policy by American military, and I'm talking about the military-industrial complex, by their interests. And indeed, there were huge corporate interests that were influencing American policy then.
Absolutely. The primary example I talk about in the book is the automotive industry, because of course they end up building vehicles for the German military. But both General Motors and Ford are heavily involved in the German market. They end up profiting from slave labor during the war very, very tragically. But they see no reason to pull out. And you can sort of put yourself to some extent in the shoes of a General Motors executive. Is it really, how can you justify to your shareholders walking away from all of this money? And so there's this perverse sort of profit motivation that really ties these businesses into profiting from bloodshed. You
see how all of these different, you would think, disparate interests actually push toward one policy. Where, if you could, and again, you started this book before Donald Trump was president, right?
2014, I started researching this, and when I started talking to people about it, initially people, colleagues and even people in sort of the industry started saying like, oh, who's going to read this book, right? Why would anyone care about this stuff? It's obscure, it's ancient history, these people are all long gone and nobody remembers them anymore. And then suddenly as events unfolded, there was more and more interest in this. So this was not a book that I wrote with any political motivation in mind whatsoever. It just so happened that history started rhyming a little bit more as I was writing it.
So tell me how the America First policy, which you clearly see in this time of Hitler's fascism, tell me how that played then, how it's playing now, and if there really are similarities between the America First of today and the America First of World War II.
So the original America First is actually founded at Yale University. It's founded by some young Republicans who are advocating, again, against the war. But America First is not just about foreign policy in this period. And this is something that actually I didn't know much about until I started digging into it. But the whole idea of American First originally was that the U.S. should actually turn itself inward. So rather than looking to international markets, or rather than looking especially to Europe, the U.S. should focus itself on the U.S. itself and Latin America. Latin America is sort of seen as the place where the U.S. can legitimately interfere. But certainly you should stay out of Europe and European wars. And so the original America First has this sort of broad sort of critique of what the country's role in the world is. And I think we can certainly see some echoes of that today. I think it's a good question, I think, and one that I've never heard sufficiently answered, is when President Trump chose this as his slogan, how much of this was he actually aware of? How much of the history of America First, or someone like a Steve Bannon, who probably had more of a hand in that, was this a deliberate invocation of this, or is it just merely coincidental? I think it could actually be either.
Right. That might be a tougher call because you don't feel like Donald Trump's really got much of a sense of history, except maybe a cartoonish one. At least.
Well, indeed, and I think you'd also have to ask yourself, if he chose it deliberately, who was that appealing to? I mean, is this something that is sort of subsumed in the American subconscious? Has this been a tradition that's been carried on in, So one interesting aspect about this book too is that these people didn't just all disappear in 1941. The former America First had 800,000 members nationwide. What happened to these people after the war? And this was something I actually tried to find out and trace down oral histories, or even find people who might still be alive today who have been involved in this, and I could find very little. So I think it's interesting that this stuff sort of just disappears from the political spectrum, but certainly the people didn't disappear. And so was this sort of passed down through families? Were these discussions still taking place? It's sort of unclear.
Well, the rhetoric of America First is actually effective political rhetoric, right? I mean, you can't help but, yeah, of course, America First.
It's a brilliant slogan, it really is. And when the president chose that as part of his campaign, again, I wasn't sure whether he was directly trying to evoke this historical precedent, but I thought it was actually a very apt slogan for what he was trying to put forward.
It's interesting, Lasse, I wish we had more time, but it's so intriguing. Again, the book is Hitler's American Friends. In America, there were so many different interests sort of supporting one interest. Do you see that constellation of interests again today? I mean, we've established they're kind of kissing cousins today and back then, but where are they dissimilar and where are they similar?
I think we have an interesting constellation of things happening now. We certainly have a rise of the far right, and by that I mean with the people we saw marching in Charlottesville. Shocking stuff to see the swastika again carried next to the American flag, and of course, as you just showed the cover of the book, that is the imagery that we have there, is combining the swastika with these symbols of Americanism. So I think what's interesting now is that we do have certainly an alignment of corporate interests that are supporting the current administration. We know that. Certainly the tax bill was sort of a handout and a nod to that. But we also have these sort of more dangerous sort of far right groups, and that's what we had in the 1930s as well, where we did have General Motors, Ford, interested in not having a war in Europe because they might lose money on it, essentially. But we also had these far-right, more dangerous groups that are actually in support of the Nazis. And so I think there is a similarity there. I think we do have to be skeptical, though, of trying to draw a direct comparison because, of course, history never repeats itself. History rhymes, if anything. And so I think, to some extent, we lose the argument when we say that there's a direct similarity between any contemporary person and Hitler. But I think it's very important for us to recognize the similarities between the rhetoric and what's going on.
Very well put. I would love to get you in our next conversation to talk about whether or not history repeats itself. That might be I might disagree on a couple, but you're the real historian, so I will yield to you on that. Again, the book is Hitler's American Friends. So cool to spend some time with Bradley Hart. Really intriguing, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Good luck with the book.
Thank you very much.
Like what you see? I hope so. Thank you. So click the subscribe button below, and don't forget to ring the bell to never miss another video from Rebel HQ.